As always, we'll wait for a couple of minutes before we start the show for today. All right. Hello and welcome. My name is Amogh Aparna Maheshchandra, and I welcome you all to yet another conversation of PhD, the philosophical drama. Friends, whenever we think about a scientist, the first picture that comes to our mind is a person standing in a lab with a lab coat, with goggles on his eyes or her eyes, with gloves in the hands, and mixing chemical A into chemical B, or with a laser shooting a beam onto some object. But imagine if you know a story of a scientist, a person who finished his PhD, where he or she has not really done any of this sort in the PhD time and actually sat in front of a computer, tried to solve research problems. Exactly. This is a story of such a person today. His name is Sharath Chandra. He did his PhD in USA in Georgia University, and currently he's a postdoc at New York. So let me welcome him to the show and add him to the show so we can have a conversation with him.
Hey,
Hello. All okay? You can hear my voice?
yeah. Am I
Perfect.
clear?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, good.
So सबसे पहले, first of all, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining in at the scheduled time, in spite of it being a Sunday morning at your end.
Yeah,
Sorry to disturb you in your sleep on Sunday morning. Uh, to start with, I want to ask you about uh, a question that I ask almost everyone. When was the first exposure to science as such for you, and and did that exposure trigger you to like dream of becoming a scientist in the future?
fair enough. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say thanks for the invite. And so, my parents, like any middle class Indian parents, wanted me to become an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
That would go join an IIT. So they've geared me towards that path since I was like 7 or 8.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, so like they used to tell me, okay, so this is where IITs are, so you should try and get into one of those. Not
Mm-hmm.
pushed me per se, but more like, oh, these are the opportunities, this is what we want you to do, because none of us have done a science degree or an engineering degree. All
Mm-hmm.
both my parents had like a bachelor's in uh, languages. Like my dad has a bachelor's in Sanskrit, and my mom has a bachelor's in Telugu and Sanskrit.
Wow.
So yeah, so they just wanted us to choose a different path. And my dad had lots of my dad's a pundit, and he knew lots of people who visited him for like traditional ceremonies and stuff. So through those people, I got access to the British Library, and
Okay.
I used to get I used to borrow lots of books from there, and then it started out as a fascination towards learning facts, and it ended up big. I ended up getting drawn towards astrophysics because my best friend in high school was planning on becoming an astrophysicist himself, and but then eventually I ended up liking chemistry more, or chemistry more than physics, mainly because lots of people thought chemistry was just remembering things and stuff. So I
Right.
wanted to prove them wrong. So I was like, okay, let's switch to chemistry. And then I moved to ICER, uh, and that's where I actually had my first taste for what science is like, outside of what I thought science was.
Okay, so your first exposure out of textbook to science was at ICER Pune.
Yeah,
So it was not a very a childhood dream of becoming a scientist, but eventually you found your way and you ended up doing your PhD.
yeah. It was more like, oh, I want to be an astrophysicist, or I want to be an astronaut, or something like that. But it was never a concrete dream. It was never
Mhm.
something I was going to pursue.
Nice, nice. Uh, the next interesting question is you were an experimentalist in your bachelor's and master's time, and then you suddenly shifted your gears and moved to something that we call theoretical uh, science, or something that a layman doesn't understand how science is done on a computer. So how was this switch for you? How did you end up doing this?
So back even when I was in ICER, most of the things I did were in the lab, but most of my coursework was in physics because I wanted to understand why reactions happen at a fundamental level. So I was
Hmm.
trying to dig up literature, understand what's happening, and that's where I chanced upon the uh, alternative to doing wet lab chemistry. That is
Hmm.
simulating molecules using a computer. At
Hmm.
that
Okay.
at that point, my understanding of computational chemistry was minimal. All I knew was, oh, you can use computers to get to simulate reactions, and it's much faster. At that point, I used to think it was much faster than actually doing a reaction, because when you go into a lab, you have to be careful. You're limited. You're throttled by uh, the availability of chemicals, or your own expertise, or your own skill set, or whatever
Right.
is available in the lab you're working, right? So I was under the impression that, oh, once it'd be easier for me to study reactions if I were to just simulate them, because all I need is a computer.
Hmm.
And but I also liked doing experiments, and I thought it was necessary to first experience chemistry in a lab and then decide if it's worth continuing or not. And
Right.
after my stint at ICER, I've decided, okay, I've had enough of wet chemistry. Let me actually see what it means to model a reaction. Because I
Okay.
spent 4 years in the wet lab, and now I spend 4 years as a computational chemist.
Right. Wonderful. But how was that switch? दिन भर लैब में काम करके
Yeah.
जिसे आई मीन प्रॉपरली ओवरनाइट रिएक्शंस लगाना, वर्किंग रियली लेट, moving towards sitting in front of a computer and like spending time there.
Yeah. So the switch, so one would assume the switch to be one would assume doing computational chemistry is very different to doing wet lab chemistry, but my approach remained the same in the early stages. I used to go in around 9, stay till like 8 or 9. So a typical day looks like this: you go in, start making molecules,
Mhm.
on the computer. So you use different tools to make the molecules. You make the molecules, and then uh, you submit them to the so submitting a job is submitting a molecule for computations is the equivalent of setting up the reaction in the
Right.
lab. You add everything. Adding everything is equivalent to making the molecules on a computer, and then running the actual reaction is equivalent to submitting the molecule for the computer to do the reaction, and then you wait on
Right.
the results. So after you are done setting up the reaction, you take a small break, and then you come back. You see if you have any results. If not, you'll start trying. You'll do the same process with a different reaction, for example, or you'll do the
Right.
literature search to see what's happening. And by the time you're done with all of this, your reaction will be done. But unlike how uh, unlike how we have to do post reaction workup and post reaction purification and stuff, that step doesn't exist. We can just straight out go and do the analysis part. So
Right.
the first
Right. You
time,
you
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So the first time you set up a simulation, the result, when you start looking at the results, it feels exciting because you can see everything you learned about molecules. You can see it happen. For example, we've learned about these vibration modes when we take an IR spectra, right? Oh, this is the
Right.
OH stretch. But once your simulation is done, you can actually visualize that OH stretch. So
Yes.
it's fascinating because you can see everything that you learn in a textbook on the screen. Because for me, at least, I don't have the ability to visualize things.
Mm-hmm.
So that was probably the first time I could see something really happening in front of my eyes.
Right. Right. Yeah, you partly answered my next question, but we can discuss more on that front, which was what is a typical daily routine? Because one would argue that computational people can actually sit at home and run their simulations,
Yeah.
or they can actually just submit a job and go and have a walk by the lake or have a beer. But these are things that experimentalists think and believe.
Yeah.
But as you said, you would go in at 9, come back at 8.
Yeah.
Uh, what was the time when you would go out for for some getting some fresh air, because you're practically having no physical workout. You're sitting in front of a computer all day. Uh, how was that inculcated into your daily routine?
So part of the things I skipped out earlier were the break times, right? So you have if you're only working on one reaction, you have a significant amount of downtime. So you turn in a
Mhm.
bunch of things, you're waiting on those. So you can use that time however you see fit. Uh,
Right.
as you said, one can do the simulations from home too, right? It's
Right.
and a lot of days when things are not working, like you would like to take a break, so you just stay at home all day, just turn in something and just stay at home and do some chores or get some fresh air. But on a typical day, I would go out for lunch. So
Mhm.
that would include long walks and coming back from lunch. And
Mhm.
coffee breaks also involved going around the campus, just looking around and maybe walking towards a library or something. And during the weekends was when I used to get an actual break. So the key thing is, as you mentioned, you don't get the workout or the physical activity that you get when you're working in a wet lab. Uh,
Right.
so so you have to try to balance it somehow. And the way I used to do that was play racquetball or something. But lots of people
Mhm. Okay.
enjoy biking or like you have enough time to pick an activity and do it on a consistent basis.
Yeah, that's a very good part of your daily routine as a computational scientist.
Yeah.
Uh,
And it comes with it's an advantage that because you can work from home, you can schedule the work hours in such a way that you can allot some time to do other things. So I am predominantly active at night, and I'm not very active early in the day. So
right.
my work hours gradually shift. Even if I start at 9 on Monday, by the end of the week, my work hours shift from like noon to like midnight or something.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah,
it,
this is another point that I wanted to discuss is uh, the work hours are very heavy in academia in general. But I mean, in your case, there is an advantage of doing things from home, but there is also this disadvantage that one would feel that you can do things at any given point of time because everything that you need is accessible to you.
yeah.
How difficult it is to then explain to people that no, we need a break, and it's not trivial to just start a simulation on the computer.
So that's the other thing most people don't like. Most experimentalists can't uh, fathom that they'll say, "Oh, we are done with our reactions. Can you predict? Can you give us the simulations next week?" That's
Right,
not how it works because a simulation
right,
takes forever to run. So
right,
you set up something and then you have to constantly troubleshoot. The biggest problem of being a computational chemist or a computational scientist is essentially you can work at whatever time you want or whatever hours you want. So you end up working all the time, all the
right.
week, all of it. So it's there. There are also a lot of my friends are much better at this than I am, where they strictly define their work week and their work hours and then stick to it. So that's probably the ideal way to approach such a problem. So decide you start the week at 9 a.m. and then start the work day at 9 a.m. Close it off at 6 p.m. no matter what. And
Hmm.
then do it for 5 days a week. That's the ideal version of it. Don't bother
Right,
about it over the weekend. But then there's always this temptation because no one else is using the supercomputer or no one else is using the computer on the weekend. So you'll be tempted. It's tempting to not um, sit idle and just set up something because no one else is
right,
using it. It's like
right, right,
there's one herd for 10 people and everyone knows that no one comes on the weekend, so the one guy who comes on the weekend gets to use that food. It's the
right,
similar situation.
right. Interesting stuff in terms of hours that you need to put in.
Yeah.
And how is it about dealing with failures? Because for an experimentalist, one can argue that we see something not happening in our hands, or we change parameters in terms of whatever it is, whatever reagents we are using, we can change them or try a different route to doing things. But what is it like dealing with failures in a computational world? What kind of failures do you guys have? How do you deal with those?
So currently computational science is like people would like to think that it is a predictive science. In
Hmm.
some situations we can predict things and it works out fine, but in a lot of situations we are trying to explain what we see experimentally. So a typical failure is our inability to simulate what's actually happening. So,
Hmm.
say for example, you mixed A and B, and you expect to see C, uh,
Hmm.
and we run the simulation, and we see C, but then we also see D, depending on
Hmm.
how the energies work out. And
Right,
then, if we can never get C to be the major product, then we cannot publish it. So
right,
that means we cannot understand, we cannot explain why you are seeing C experimentally. So the common ways to troubleshoot would be to change the model, to come up with other explanations that might be, or use other techniques. But
Mm-hmm.
that's the biggest problem. So the other issue that we have is the lack of uh, control experiments. It's
Right.
very hard to come up with a control experiment in computational chemistry,
Mm-hmm.
at least based on what I've done so far, things I've looked at. Because all the control experiments that you could think of need to be tested experimentally, right?
Right.
So, yeah. Like when it comes to using a certain technique or a certain tool, you can use some well-known benchmarks or some control experiments. You can design control experiments when it comes to the tools you're using. But when it comes to the result, explaining the results, experimental results, it gets a little bit tricky because again, experimentalists think that for an experimentalist, it's 2 or 3 days work. For a computational chemist, it's the 2 or 3 days of computer work. The computer is doing the work for 3 days. It's not
Right.
me doing it physically. So there is that
Right.
difference. Before I can ask an experimentalist to do something, I should be confident that that's going to help us.
Right.
So there is also the biggest thing is there's always this talk with an experimentalist or with an
Right.
experimental paper. You always look through the paper multiple times to see if you can find something, some small detail that can help you. So that's one way to um, cope up with the failures. Like in an experimental lab, if your reaction doesn't work, the next thing you would do is change the conditions a little, right?
Right.
So it's harder to change conditions a little in computations. So what we would do
Right.
is look for something that can help us. And the
Right.
best place to look at is the experimental detail.
Right. Right. This leads me to my next point is uh, it so often happens that computationalists are taken as a secondary batch of people who will prove what the experiment shows, like
Yeah.
experiment from the experimentalist point of view,
Mhm.
or they are asked to predict few things that you can work out in an experimental lab. In this case, how does it feel to be the second fiddle most of the time, or is it not the case?
So it depends on the type of problems you're picking. So, uh, for example, you can pick a reaction to model, and an experimentalist can do has already everything that an experimentalist can do has already been done, but that still didn't give you an understanding of why that reaction is happening, right? That's
Mhm.
where the modeling comes, because you can test out as many ideas as you have for a mechanism that
Right.
is that is practically impossible to test. There are not impossible, but there are practical limitations when it comes to testing a mechanistic hypothesis experimentally. Because you can never prove a mechanism, you can only disprove the ones that aren't possible. And it's
Right.
easier to simulate 1,000 pathways and prove that 999 of those don't work. So the one
Okay.
thing that you're left is that one thing that works, that can explain what's happening. But if you were to do those 999 control experiments physically, it's just impossible. So if you pick the right kind of problem, then computations can be a very powerful tool and will not be like seen as a supporting tool.
Right.
So
Right. Right. Yeah. That's interesting to know. Uh, Next part is something that I'm going to ask about a very special situation that has been happening in the last 1 year, uh, where COVID struck and all experimental labs were shut down. But computational people still could work from home
yeah.
and still could were productive enough or not so. I don't know the exact data. I don't have the data. But how was it to sit at home and yet you had to be productive enough because hey, you can just run a simulation from home
Yeah.
and it's okay. There's a pandemic around in the world, but you can work. Come on. What was that phase of your PhD time or your research time?
So that's an interesting question because um I've been thinking about it a lot. So,
Hmm.
like you said again, lots of people expect a computational chemist to not have any issues during the lockdown, during the pandemic, because hey, you
Right,
don't need to be physically present to do any of this.
right,
Uh, but the problem is, no matter how much you prefer to work alone, you still end up going to the, like, at least all of my friends who are computational chemists, they still end up going to the lab, trying, like, meet another person, because that's where the ideas get exchanged, the
right,
discussion. You and if you're because we're all cooped up in our own apartments,
right,
it's gotten it's gotten much harder to interact on a day-to-day basis, and the
right,
overall burnout kicked in much later than for most experimentalists, but the burnout did kick in because the lack of human interaction and the enormous pressure of constantly generating the data, because you're a computational chemist and you're not limited by
right,
the
right,
lockdown, right? So
right.
that wears on a person, and most of my friends
Absolutely.
have suffered drastic losses in their productivity. And there are also numerous studies which show that even though programmers and other computational and data scientists don't necessarily have to be at their workplace, their
Hmm.
productivity is still suffered for various reasons.
Right.
One of it being this lack of social uh, contact, I guess,
Social interaction, maybe.
social
Yeah.
interaction. Yeah. So,
Yeah. Yeah. This is also valid in the general sense, even in normal times, in non-COVID times, right?
yeah.
And that is something I wanted to also discuss is because you're so hooked up to a computer all day, all your time of PhD, how difficult, how easy is to actually walk out and talk to a person, not just a lab person, but interacting with people around, because experimentalists will walk around different labs, getting ideas, getting reagents, getting stuff from different labs, using up instruments from different labs, but have everything on your desk. And
Yeah.
how difficult, how easy it is to really have that social interaction done.
To be honest, uh, it's much harder to interact with someone else, precisely because you have everything you need.
Right.
So for a lot of people, it just ends up being their own little lab space and maybe neighbors, right?
Mhm.
But um, but it but you still attend seminars, you still attend classes together. So there is
Right.
some way to interact with other people for a little bit, and then other than that, you'll also meet with whoever you make friends with, right? Like once you
Right.
start attending classes together, you'll make some new friends, but the topic gets like the topics you'll be discussing are similar to, oh, how's your research going? How's my research going? Oh, this is a problem I think I'm having, and
Right.
can you help? What do you think about this? Or what do I think about their problem? So
Right. Right.
it it almost ends up being a research discussion and not necessarily generic social interaction. at least in my case, it was always similar to what I described a little while back. It's just
Right,
how the
right,
research. Yeah.
right. And then this leads to the next point is, uh, because you're so much interested, I know for sure, as because I know you personally, you're interested in science outreach in general. So, how difficult it is to take your science and explain to a layman that you do this on the computer? Because, for example, for a cancer biologist, he or she can just explain what they are trying to do in cancer, finding out a pathway, or looking at a drug delivery system or something like that. But when you talk about your science to a layman, even as you said, you don't have parents who are from the same background. So when you talk about your science to them, how easy or difficult it becomes to explain to them what you do.
So I found it easier to explain what I did in my undergrad because they could relate to
Right,
practical applications of what I was doing
right,
back then. But what I do right now, I generally try to relate it to a practical application. So
mm-hmm.
right now I try to say, oh, I model reactions which end up as drug molecules, the
Mm-hmm.
generic for some drug. But we need to understand how those molecules are formed so that we can make more of those molecules.
Right,
And
right,
I also try to put all of these in the context of gaming and try to
okay,
cite relevant examples like the protein folding problem, right?
right,
So the protein folding problem has been gamified, and then people are trying to solve it using thousands of humans trying to play it as a game. So
right, right,
yeah, so there are some ways you can, because technology is so prevalent these days, it's easier to put my research in the context of a game or in the context of what what is the potential of what is
right,
the downfield application of what I'm doing, rather than trying to explain what I'm doing at the fundamental level.
right. You are setting up a base basically,
Yeah,
a
it's much
foundation.
better to explain what I'm doing at the fundamental level or why is it even relevant without
Right,
actually talking about, say, drugs or something else, right? So,
right, right.
but I assume this problem is similar to most. This is the exact same problem that a lot of theoreticians have too,
Mm-hmm.
because their work is so far out of the generic applications that laymen are used to.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Interesting to know. Uh, has there any great fun time that you remember that something happened and it was hilarious? Because for an experimentalist, things do happen. You mix up something, two different things, or you accidentally drop something into a bacterial falcon, and something else happens. But what are these kind of moments in a computational point of view, and what are the mistakes in a way that you guys do?
So there is a story where this is with respect to my first project. So the first project I
Mhm.
was given was to explain why you're seeing one enantiomer over the other enantiomer for some reaction, right?
Okay.
And every simulation I ran for like 8 months always gave me the minor enantiomer as the major product computationally.
Yeah, just
Uh,
just to be sure that our non-science background viewers
oh yeah,
understand, enantiomers are basically just
like
two compounds that look similar and they have minor differences in a layman language,
okay,
and
yeah.
you can get one over the other, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so let me rephrase that in a different way then. So say you're doing some reaction, you get two products, C and D, and
Hmm.
experimentally you observe C to have the higher concentration than D.
Right.
Uh, but whenever I did computations, I always ended up getting D as the higher concentration than C.
Okay.
until one day, like 10 months down the line, I ended up getting. So at this point, I was not visualizing the molecules anymore. I could just look at the output and then say, okay, what's happening? So
Mm-hmm.
the output, I got the C as the higher concentration. So I ran into my PI's office. It's like, oh, come, I want to show you something. I finally did it. And both of
Okay.
us logged, and then we pulled up the file to visualize it. It was not the right molecule.
Okay.
So it's like, oops, too bad. My was like, too bad, just try more.
Okay.
That's very funny because I was very excited because it's done. That was like troubling me day and night for 10 months. I thought I found the
Right.
solution, but I didn't. So, yeah,
Okay.
that's
That
so
right.
those things happen too. Like you
Yeah.
think you had one thing, but then when you actually look at the molecule, it's not what you thought it was.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's funny, but it's also a kind of a failure. You feel not so good about it after the point.
Yeah.
Uh, so, Sharath, you have had a very interesting and a very unique story of your PhD because you've been trained as a experimentalist till your masters, and then you switched gears and you moved on to computational lab, and you found your path there. Now you're looking forward to a good postdoc, uh, and to add to it, there is no great science background, as you said, in your family. It's not a science background, and you're one of the unique scientists in the family. Uh, Having come forth to this level, what kind of advice, typical advice that you give to people who are A, wanting to do science, and B, really hoping to get into computational science?
Um, First thing is, if you don't know very much about computers, it's still okay because I've known very little about computers till I was in like till I before I joined ICER, I knew very little about computers.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always a lot of time for you to learn these things, and making the switch appears to be hard, but once you make the switch, you can carry on the same work ethics you have as an experimentalist, like the same routine. You can practically do the same things.
Right.
Just instead of doing them, think of it as doing a reaction on a computer instead of doing a reaction in the hood. So then the transition becomes easier to conceptualize, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as far as how I guess a lot of science is essentially serendipitous, but
Right.
the one thing that I read on one of the posters a few years back was in academia, the more you read, the more you know. The more you know, the further
Mhm.
you go. So the biggest
Right.
advice is just read. It can be anything. It can be a journal article. It can be science fiction. So science fiction was the way I got into science completely.
Mm-hmm.
I read a lot of Isaac Asimov.
Okay.
So yeah, so the more you read, the more you learn. The more you learn, uh, the more opportunities you make for yourself. But a lot of it, ultimately, a lot of it is serendipitous. So you just have to
Right.
keep trying, I guess.
Yeah, but more from a point of view of uh, getting more young kids interested in science. As you said, you were interested because of science fiction majorly.
Yeah.
Uh, what else would you tell such kids to get them interested in science? Clearly, it's not something that you want people to by heart and get good marks at the school level. It's
Yes.
not, science is just not limited to that.
Yeah. So the other thing that I found very interesting growing up was I would look at something and I would try to come up with as many possible explanations as I can, and then I would go find someone, some adult essentially, and shoot all the explanations I had at them. So
Right.
that that actually helps. So if you want to get kids interested in it, show them something without actually telling them the
Hmm.
reason behind it, and then ask ask them to come up with possible solutions, possible explanations, and
Explanations,
then
right.
uh, that's how you can start inculcating the scientific thinking, and then you can ask to test why it will work or why it might not work. You can also give gentle nudges in that direction by helping them with some hypothesis and some experiment. So
Right. Right.
ultimately, a lot of people I've met di- had the curiosity to do things on their own, and so one of the professors I had blew up his garage like a couple times growing up.
Okay. Okay.
So, yeah, so things like that. Don't blow up the garage, but do
Right.
smaller things.
Yeah. Find out why what happens
Yeah,
with
that's
whatever
that's
you see.
something most Indian schools don't do, right? Like at least the schools I went to, like we never had any practical experimentation. So if you want,
Hmm.
if we, like that's one thing that I've been looking into, designing experiments to get kids interested in something
Right.
similar. Disha at ICER did a lot of
Hmm.
those when I
Right.
was there, and I still think I think they're still doing those. So
Yes, they're still doing it. Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah. That's very interesting to know that you have this part as well going on at the sides of your busy academic career. And thank you so much for joining us today and taking us through the bites of your computational PhD, I would say. And hope to meet you sometime soon, somewhere.
sure.
Till then, take care and uh, go ahead with your wonderful career.
Yep. Thanks for the invite. See you around.
See you. Bye bye.
Bye.
You will have to probably, yep. Yeah. So that was a story of Sharath Chandra, who's a computational scientist right now and he's doing a postdoc. So it was interesting to know the aspects of failures and how to deal with daily routines in a different format of a PhD. I hope you all enjoyed the show today and we'll meet 1 week later. We're taking a break again for the first week of April. And then in the second week of April, we have another interesting session with another storyteller. Till then, take care and stay happy and stay healthy. See you.